Good afternoon. My name's Stuart McIntyre and I have the privilege of chairing this afternoon's lecture. I want to begin by acknowledging the traditional owners of the land, the Wurundjeri people, and acknowledge the custodians past and present. Could I ask you to check that your mobile phones, pages and other instruments are turned off? And I should also advise you that the proceedings are being filmed, and the advice I'm asked to give is that if you don't wish to appear on film, then refrain from asking a question or possibly even ducking down when the person in front of you does. I should also acknowledge Trinity College, who have supported the festival by bringing the Caldwell lecturers, Sir David Cannadine and Professor Linda Colley, to Australia, and that's in fulfilment of the intent of the Colin Hicks Caldwell Trust, which is designated for the attraction of notable international scholars in the fields of art, history, law or literature. Professor Linda Colley is undoubtedly a notable international scholar. She's a leading historian of Britain, the British Empire and the peoples it encompassed. She trained at Bristol University and Cambridge. She's held appointments at Cambridge, Yale, the London School of Economics, and since 2003 she's been the Shelby MC Davis Professor of History at Princeton. Some of you will be familiar with her publications, but they include studies of 18th century British politics, a study of that seminal British historian, Lewis Namier. Her 1992 book, Britain's Forging the Nation, was an extremely influential account of the making of that identity of Britons out of the components of the United Kingdom. It drew on a large body of material and drew it into a compelling whole, and not least among the works that she placed so instructively in that framework was The Provenance, as well as the exploits of Commander James Bond. In 2002, she published Captives, Britain, Empire and the World, 1600 to 1850, which I read as a particularly successive exercise in history from below and all that could illuminate. And in 2007, she explored the complexities of the imperial experience further with her study of the ordeal of Elizabeth Marsh. Now, many of you will be familiar with those books, but some who haven't might well have encountered Linda Colley's incisive reviews in serials such as the London Review of Books, or her op-ed commentaries in which she brings historical understanding to bear on contemporary concerns. And in a week when some of us are celebrating the recognition of our own historian Graham Davison in the Australian Honours List, it's doubly appropriate to note that in 2009 Linda Colley was appointed a Commander of the Order of the British Empire. The subject of her lecture today is Asserting Identity, Writing Constitutions, Britain, America and Australia, and I have great pleasure in inviting Linda to deliver the lecture.
Thank you very much, Stuart, for that very generous introduction. I want to thank you all for coming, and I want more specifically to thank Trinity College for all its hospitality and sponsorship, but perhaps most of all to thank and congratulate the University of Melbourne for this wonderful festival, which I think is really fantastic, amazing. As Stuart said, my topic is Asserting Identity, Writing Constitutions, Britain, America and Australia. Monday, September the 17th, 1787, witnessed the completion in Philadelphia of one of the most influential documents in modern history. The text in question was the work of 55 delegates who had devoted over 4 months to debating and arguing over its contents. By no means all of these men expressed enthusiasm about the final polished product. Some indeed actively rejected it. Nonetheless, Here the finished document now was, 4,400 words, written in fine clerical hand on just 4 large sheets of parchment, the brand new Constitution of the United States of America. Now, there had been earlier attempts in different parts of the world to write down and summarize systems of government. But in at least 4 respects, the US Federal Constitution of 1787 represented something that was distinctive and innovatory. First, it was the product of and came increasingly to be seen as standing proxy for a Republican experiment that aspired, at least in part, to certain important democratic ideals. Second, this US Constitution was the first in history for which a measure of mass ratification was sought, so that not only most of its authors, but also large numbers of ordinary citizens gave their formal consent to its contents. Third, this US Constitution sought to do much more than to outline how a particular political system was to operate. As the Sydney academic Helen Irving has written, in 1787, the American framers took the historically original and remarkable step of using this Constitution to name and identify a people. We, the people of the United States, is how this most famous written Constitution begins. The clear implication, as George Washington remarked in his farewell address in 1796 when he leaves the presidency, was that a people had the right to determine what their constitutions of government were to be. A political constitution was no longer something that people merely lived under and tolerated. Rather, a constitution was now being presented as ideally an outcrop of a particular people and of what they aspired to, as a written expression of them. There was a further important respect in which this 1787 US Constitution proved groundbreaking. Because it was drafted at a period in history when the numbers of newspapers and print networks were expanding internationally and exponentially, and when transport mechanisms on land and sea were also widening fast, this document quickly and increasingly came to achieve a transcontinental audience. Made up of words and easily translated into any language and summarized, the US Constitution lent itself to ceaseless reproduction wherever print was in existence and was able to penetrate. And the repercussions of this international exposure were rapid and dramatic. Almost immediately, the American Constitution proved a major influence on French revolutionaries and on the 4 new constitutions that were drafted in France during the 1790s. These French revolutionary constitutions, together with the US Constitution, in turn influenced successive revolutionary constitutions in Haiti, where black activists quickly began demanding, in the 1790s, some of the same kinds of rights and freedoms that white revolutionaries were struggling for in Europe and the Americas. And this was just the beginning. In 1786, no country had possessed a single legal document that it formally styled a constitution. Yet by 1820, continental Europe alone had generated at least 48 written constitutions, most of which, like the Constitution of Westphalia of 1807, the first ever German constitution, were byproducts in some ways of the Napoleonic Wars, because the Napoleonic Wars really spreads written constitutions across continental Europe. Between 1820 and 1850, over 80 more constitutions were drafted, many of them in Latin America, where some newly independent republics, such as Chile, went through multiple constitutions. During the second half of the 19th century, written constitutions spread to some non-Western polities, such as Egypt and Japan. And by the end of the 20th century, as you know, written constitutions had become almost universal, though in some regions these texts have remained markedly unstable and transient. Of the 200 or so national constitutions that exist today, over half have been written or rewritten during the last quarter century. Written constitutions, then, of the sort pioneered in Philadelphia in 1787, have become an integral, though often contested, component of our modern global landscape. But precisely in part because written constitutions are now so ubiquitous and such familiar phenomena, they can easily, I think, be taken for granted. They may be treated respectfully, but they are often not scrutinized or interrogated all that much, or even very much read. The fact that most of the commentators who have sought to explicate and interpret written constitutions have always been jurists or legal scholars of some kind has only encouraged, I suspect, this more general public neglect. However learned, close legal analyses of written constitutions can have the effect of making these vital, often rich and divisive texts appear arcane, overly abstract, even fusty. If recent opinion polls are to be believed, even in the United States, the vast majority of citizens never bother to read their constitution. Even among the political class, even indeed among some US politicians, as has become clear, many Americans apparently possess now only a vague idea of what the 1787 federal constitution contains, and indeed of what it does not contain. Thus, recent pollsters have found that many Americans express astonishment when being informed that the US Constitution makes no mention at all of the word God. Opinion polls also suggest, however, that over 85% of Americans say that the Constitution is an important and integral part of their lives. Yet manifestly, whatever the Constitution is that some of these people claim to reverence, it is not the one that is actually written down on paper. For many Americans, and of course it's not just true of Americans, the Constitution is rather an icon, a myth, a generalized patriotic idea, something to be believed in, but not actually read. Now, the fact that for so many Americans, and I stress not just for Americans, a constitution is often more an imaginary and emotional artifact than actual words on paper, points to the central issue that I want to address in this lecture today. What connections are there between written constitutions on the one hand and identity on the other. And what sorts and scale of identities are involved exactly? In what sense have these extraordinary texts been able to operate since 1787? And in what sense have they been designed to operate as delineations of and points of reference for whole peoples, for nations? I want to examine some different aspects of these questions. First, in relation to Britain, a polity that reputedly has no written constitution. Then, in regard to the United States, and finally, in regard to Australia, which constructed its own Commonwealth Constitution Act in the late 1890s and 1900, in part out of a conscious mix of British and American ideas and institutions. So let's start with Britain. It's easy, though I would argue it is also misleading, to view Britain as being invariably and straightforwardly out of step with the trend after 1787 towards written constitutions, and even as antagonistic towards it, as, if you like, the anti-model of written constitutions. After all, Americans had been obliged to fight for independence from Britain in order to draft their constitution in the first place. Moreover, it was certainly the case that many conservative and establishment Britons were actively and persistently hostile to what they often termed paper constitutions. Apparently coined in Britain in the early 1780s and in sustained use there from 1792, the phrase paper constitution was employed and elaborated upon in British parliamentary speeches, newspapers, and books, invariably in a negative manner, until at least the 1980s. Those paper constitutions, grumbled a future British Prime Minister, William Gladstone, in the 1850s, which have been the curse of the world for so many years. Paper constitution proved an often useful put-down because it suggested that these new-style written constitutions were at once lacking in real value, intrinsically fragile, and characterized by a kind of doctrinaire artifice. Paper constitutions were like the stuff of bookshops, some British critics accused, as some still do, over-intellectual or ephemeral. Or as the great Victorian historian and liberal politician Lord Macaulay complained, paper constitutions resembled paper money, trashy, unreliable substitutes for real gold. By contrast, supporters of the British Constitution often likened it to all or part of the human body, thereby emphasizing that it was something organic and real and substantial, and capitalizing on traditional notions of what was meant by a good constitution. To have a good constitution was, of course, to be healthy. And this kind of discourse, by linking the British Constitution with the body, stresses that the British polity is also healthy, as paper constitutions are supposedly not. And incidentally, these ideas went back a long way to medieval notions and even to biblical notions. St. Paul talks of the importance of law being inscribed on the fleshy tablets of the heart, and how these kind of interior laws are much more important than exterior laws. And British supporters of the traditional uncodified British Constitution are drawing on these very ancient notions. He firmly believed the English Constitution was enthroned in the affections of their bosoms. The great philosopher Edmund Burke told the House of Commons in 1791 that they cherished it as part of their nature, and that it was inseparable from Englishmen as their souls and bodies. Burke's near mystical adulation of the English and British Constitution led him on another occasion to claim that there was absolutely no need to translate Magna Carta out of the original Latin in order to make it popularly accessible, because every true Briton, he contended, was able naturally to understand this medieval Charter of Liberties. It was just something that you could do if you were British. This argument that the uncodified British Constitution was somehow innate and intrinsically natural, a birthright rather than an artificial construct of mere words, was also made visually. There's a famous satirical print by the brilliant graphic artist James Gilray called "Fashion Before Ease," or "A Good Constitution Sacrificed for a Fantastic Form." It shows the one-time staymaker and fiercely radical Thomas Paine brutally tight-lacing a buxom and beautiful Britannia into French corsets, which were then partly constructed out of paper constitutions, in other words. Deprived of her shield and trident, Britannia's only defence is shown in this image to be a flourishing British oak tree, a natural and living support. And this image of the British Constitution as a tree, something natural, goes on, and indeed many 19th century Australians adopt this image and talk of themselves as a branch of the British constitutional oak. At one level, then, Britain's political classes succeeded with a considerable degree of enterprise, not to mention chutzpah, in resisting the post-1787 trend towards a new kind of written constitution. Yet at another level, this sustained British verbal and visual assault from the 1780s onwards against paper constitutions bears witness, of course, to just how influential and challenging this new political device was perceived as being. Basically, the British are having to raise their game, or at least the British ruling orders are having to raise their game in order to repel what they rightly see as a very significant new political innovation. And the British were obliged to react to the new constitutional politics in other ways too. A reverential cult of the British Constitution and its unique liberties had been evolving since the 17th century. But after the American and French revolutions, this cult became noisier and more self-conscious. By 1900, by which time virtually all Western states and some non-Western polities had drafted written constitutions, British defenders of their own unwritten constitution had been obliged to evolve a distinctive line of polemic. Other nations might crowd together and boast of their respective paper constitutions, so the argument now went, but Britain's lack of such a document was a further demonstration of just what an exceptional nation it was. In almost every country of the world, wrote a senior British constitutional lawyer as late as 1955, it is possible to buy at a bookseller's a copy of the fundamental document which establishes the organs of the state and defines the privileges and immunities of its citizens. Our own tale, he went on complacently, is very different. In other words, in Britain too, written constitutions, but in this case the absence of one, became closely bound up with assertions of national identity and distinctiveness. Let me, however, make a further point about this society, because it possesses much wider applicability. At no time has there ever been a consensus on Britain's constitution among its inhabitants. From the late 18th century up to the present, there have always been British dissidents, and not just on the left, who have argued in favour of a new written constitution. Conversely, some 18th, 19th, and even early 20th century Britons claim to believe that their country did, in fact, possess a written constitution. Some Britons claimed that this had been drafted in Anglo-Saxon times, but had subsequently been lost or suppressed. And hunting this lost Anglo-Saxon constitution was a favourite Victorian parlour game. Others believed that the Magna Carta of 1215 could and should legitimately be viewed as Britain's pioneering version of a written constitution, and you get that argument expressed quite often. And some Welsh, Scottish, Irish, and indeed English nationalists have resisted the whole idea of a British constitution and argued instead at different times for separate constitutions of their own. After the 1850s, for instance, Irish Home Rulers frequently argued for a new written Irish constitution, in part spurred on by the written constitutions being obtained by parts of Australia and New Zealand. The broader point I want to make here is a simple but fundamental one. When we speak or read of a constitution representing a particular people's identity, we have always to inquire which people exactly and when exactly. Consider in this regard the US Constitution itself. From the beginning, and for all its undoubted radical credentials and achievements, this was never simply one thing. Explicitly nation-building, republican, and proto-democratic, the US Constitution of 1787 also worked and was designed to work so as to foster internal colonialism and as an agent of discrimination. No constitution was ever so well calculated as ours for extensive empire, wrote Thomas Jefferson, who wanted American power ultimately to embrace Canada and Cuba, as well as to stretch across the American continent. Jefferson's imperial understanding of the US Constitution was scarcely a unique one. One of the American founders' explicit concerns in 1787, for instance, was to ensure that treaties approved in Washington became the law of the land, binding on judges in every state. And as the political scientist Paul Freimer has described, it was partly by means of adroit treaties with Native Americans and with the European empires that the USA was able to triple in size between 1787 and 1850. Like many other powers, including Britain and including Australia, Americans also employed written constitutions in order to record and therefore reinforce divisions between those who were deemed racially privileged and therefore entitled to full citizenship and those who were not. Thus, when the then independent Republic of Texas drafted a constitution in 1836, it granted the privileges of citizenship to everyone residing within its borders, but it also specifically excluded Africans, the descendants of Africans, and Indians. Some Native American peoples tried to fight back against such discriminatory US constitutions by drafting constitutions of their own. Most famously, and after setting up their own capital city, Supreme Court, and written laws, the Cherokees of Western Georgia drafted a famous constitution in 1827, in which they expressed the hope that in future white Americans would no longer treat them as savages, but would allow them to govern themselves. Despite all this, 10 years later, the tribe was driven out of its Georgia lands in order to make way for white settlers and profiteers. It sounds a familiar story. As James Belich reminds us in his recent, very good book, Replenishing the Earth, the use of written and printed documents, such as constitutions, to help drive out and or constrain indigenous peoples was a recurrent device, not just in the 19th century United States of America, but also in Canada, New Zealand, Australia, and South Africa, and indeed in some French, German, Spanish, and Portuguese colonial spaces as well. Written constitutions, then, have often served as a means to fabricate and narrow down national identity, and not as all-embracing expressions of complex and multiple identities. Written constitutions have also frequently operated as tools of empire, and not just of nation building, and I think this is often forgotten. In the mid-1930s, for instance, Joseph Stalin devoted an immense amount of time to working on a new Soviet written constitution. As it finally emerged, this document was, at least in theory, remarkably democratic, and over 50 million Soviet citizens ratified it, probably the most wide-ranging ratification of a written constitution ever, I suspect. But this was quintessentially an imperial constitution. It was designed by Stalin and his henchmen both to foster the appearance of democracy and to centralize power in Moscow and weld together the different Soviet republics into a new communist empire. And of course, the power, the imperial power that makes most use of written constitutions is actually the British. It's one of the great interesting and uninvestigated paradoxes of British history, that at home they talk about and value and enshrine an uncodified constitution, but overseas in their empire, and even sometimes outside it, the British are great constitution writers. As one British politician says in the 1960s, the British have no constitution of their own, but they're very good at writing constitutions for other people. I'm not sure whether they were very good, but they were certainly very active. I stress these imperial uses of written constitutions because these extraordinary instruments are sometimes viewed and interpreted in an overly monochrome and teleological fashion. They tend to be seen, I think, as quintessentially modern and benevolent instruments that have helped unerringly to advance the causes of democracy and of individual nation-states. As we've seen, however, the history of these political devices has been far more untidy than that. And this is not just because written constitutions have often been used by imperial powers and in order to discriminate on the basis of race and gender and indeed religion. Written constitutions have frequently also been used by individuals who have wanted to break down existing nations and to invent new and different and rebel identities. Take, for instance, a man called John Dunmore Lang, a Scottish Presbyterian who arrived in New South Wales in 1823, but who paid over 8 visits to Britain and the United States during the course of his life. Now, Lang, who was an extraordinarily interesting man, though I suspect also a very often irritating man, usually features in Australian history books as a Republican and a nationalist. And to a degree, this is quite right. Lang deeply admired American republicanism and constitutionalism, and he could be joyfully rude and irreverent about British politicians and colonial officials. Thus, in 1850, Lang told a cheering lecture audience in Sydney that whereas Australian emigrants to California were able to enjoy a constitution of their own, we British colonists are ever and anon to be insulted by being told by the merest ninnies at home and the various toadies and lickspittles abroad that we are not fit to frame a constitution or to govern ourselves. Strong expressions of indignation recorded the Sydney journalist who reported this speech. Yet while Lang was often happy to play the nationalist, patriotic, and anti-imperial card, he was also something of a utopian and an enthusiastic writer of constitutions. At different stages of his career, he planned a scheme of government for a colony of Germans in New Caledonia. He drafted a Declaration of Independence for Victoria, and he envisaged a brand new colony, which he called New Cornwall, in the Northern River District of New South Wales, complete with its own parliament and capital. To a degree that is often forgotten indeed, drafting constitutions was internationally something of a 19th century and early 20th century hobby and obsession. Some of these amateur constitution writers were nuts and eccentrics. Some, like Lang, were utopians of a kind, and some were fervent idealists and radicals. John Brown, for instance, the mid-19th century American anti-slavery agitator, wrote his own version of the US Constitution, including in its preamble a reference to all the oppressed people who have no rights. It is only recently that historians have started examining these more private and amateur written constitutions, and there are literally thousands of them composed in different parts of the world. Most never came to anything in terms of actual political change. Nonetheless, these private constitutions can be fascinating and illuminating documents. They illustrate how plastic and volatile and contingent the world continued to appear to many 19th and 20th century actors. This long era is often seen as an age of nationalism, an age of the nation state. But in reality, there were a great many sub-nationalisms and imagined nations in the 1800s and 1900s that never came to be, but which some individuals took very seriously and made very elaborate plans for. And I think as alternative visions of how the world is to be mapped out, these private constitutions are really a wonderful source. But what can all this history tell us about written constitutions and about constitution writing now? An important issue, given that in all three polities that I have focused on today, matters constitutional seem likely in different ways to become of increasing importance. A basic but important point is that being human artifacts, written constitutions have always been imperfect and fallible constructs, which does not mean that they are unimportant or necessarily ineffective. Much has always depended on the content of these individual documents, of course, but also on the political contexts and social contexts and economic contexts in which they have emerged. But good or bad, most written constitutions, it is worth remembering, have not survived for very long. The average longevity of all the constitutions ever drafted across the world since the 1780s to the present time has been just 18 years, 18 years. The longevity of the US Constitution, for all its various amendments, is thus completely exceptional. No less exceptional in many ways is the longevity of Australia's own constitution. The mystique that has accumulated around the US federal constitution of 1787 can indeed, I think, exert a misleading as well as an inspiring influence. It can lead, and in the past it often has led, to too great and naive expectations being invested in a single man-made document. Written constitutions are important, often useful, but they are not and never have been magic bullets. Perhaps the real value of these extraordinary and proliferating texts which have changed the government of the world, written constitutions, is not, in fact, their capacity to embody identity, which is always a very sticky concept, but rather their educative and informational potential. A British writer who was critical of his country's uncodified constitution put this point very well back in 1832. I cannot but think that one of the great errors that has been committed in this country is that statesmen have not seen the prudence of making the community acquainted with the real principles and machinery of practical government, but have kept it in their own bosoms as a sort of arcana or hidden knowledge, as if it was something that it was unsafe to let the public look into. The consequence has been an increasing want of community of feeling and understanding between statesmen and the public, when on many points, had the public been adequately instructed or initiated, they might perhaps all have gone together. As populations in virtually every country in the world grow increasingly diverse, it becomes all the more important to have available and widely proclaimed some kind of central accessible text setting out the framework of a shared, stable, democratic life, explaining and expounding how things work. I personally have no doubt that some of Britain's own post-war problems, now that the distractions of empire have ebbed and the population is infinitely more diverse, have stemmed from the lack of such a document. But as I say, it is wise not to romanticize or to expect too much from written constitutions. In Australia today, as many of you know far better than I do, matters constitutional are often very near the surface because of the distinct possibility that this country may, in the near future, become a republic. In that event, some have proposed a radically new Australian constitution, imbued with the sort of nationalist fire and, quote, uplift and zap of the US Constitution. Well, perhaps so. Who am I to say? But it is worth remembering, as we've seen, that the original US Constitution was itself an imperfect as well as a remarkable and eloquent document. It allowed slavery to persist. It assisted the extirpation of various native peoples, excluded women from citizenship, and it constructed a union that almost fell apart in the 1860s. Moreover, 1787 has gradually given rise to a cult of the Constitution in the United States that is not always healthy. US politics is currently characterized by some powerful and noisy groupings, the so-called Tea Party movement and various originalists, which want to treat the 1787 Constitution as a kind of scripture, as an unchanging, all-applicable Bible to stand for all time. I'm not sure this is very helpful or realistic. Thomas Jefferson, for one, believed that written constitutions and systems of law might well stand in need of regular rewriting, because only that way, he argued, could these sort of texts go hand in hand with the progress of the human mind. And as far as a historian like myself is concerned, the real interest of written constitutions lies not in any claim they may make to embody national identity or any kind of identity. Rather, a study of written constitutions helps reveal the multiplicity of identities and how they have altered and ebbed and flowed over time. Written constitutions, as I've tried to show today, are not just to do with states, empires, nations, laws, and politics, like novels, poems, books, pamphlets, newspapers, and works of art. Written constitutions exhibit and embody the shifting, riven, sometimes inspiring, sometimes grievous landscapes of humanity. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Linda, for such an elegant, sustained and instructive lecture. We have a limited period of time in which it is possible to ask questions. Is there a microphone that's travelling? There is. So if people would like to indicate if they'd like to ask a question. Yes.
My name is Peter Kent. A question about Britain's lack of constitution. I was reflecting as you were talking as to why there may have been a resistance to this, and I'm wondering perhaps with the class, well, your views on the reason, but one possible factor might be the class structure, and those who were in the more privileged classes may feel they would have to have something to lose if an egalitarian constitution was introduced. I'm wondering if you'd care to comment on that.
Yeah, I'm sure, and I don't think it's an accident that the British, as I said, have made written constitutions for so many peoples outside their boundaries. Now, of course, that's partly empire and a desire to influence, but I think it's also that there have been radicals and would-be constitutional lawyers at home who have not been able to cope with the vested interests there and have sort of gone outside where it was easier to create the kind of constitutional design that they would have liked to have done domestically. I mean, many of the imperial constitutional reformers between the wars are actually, and perhaps surprisingly, Fabian socialists. They can't do anything in Britain itself, so they try it overseas. But I think there's actually a more profound and basic reason. Writing a written constitution is usually something that is done at a period of national trauma or considerable change of some kind, when a country wins its independence, or when it's just been invaded and thrown out the invaders, or when it's just had a revolution or civil war. And in those kind of circumstances, there's obviously often a need to write something new, to redesign the state. But Britain, of course, has been a remarkably stable power in some ways. It's not been invaded since 1688. It hasn't had a revolution, a serious disruptive revolution, since the mid-17th century. So I think it's, it's asking a lot for politicians in normal times to say, well, how about a new constitution? There's always so many things to do. You've got to have, I think, some pressing reason to do it. I would suspect, this is just future telling, but I would suspect that if Scotland secedes from the Union, we know that the Scottish National Party wants its own written constitution. But if Scotland secedes, you may then get the remainder of the United Kingdom saying, well, perhaps we better write a document which says what we're actually still about. But I think it would need that kind of emergency to make something like that happen.
Yes.
Anne Begg-Sunter, you mentioned 1688. So what about the Bill of Rights of 1688, and how would you see that as an expression of the rights of British citizens and British identity?
The Bill of Rights is certainly important, and it does contain some quite significant human rights, like, the right not to be tortured, though that was occasionally violated. But for some reason, the Bill of Rights, I think I know the reason. The Bill of Rights never acquired the kind of significance in the British imagination of the Magna Carta. I think precisely because the Magna Carta was so long ago and also was in Latin, and despite what Burke said, most people couldn't read it, therefore they could imagine what it said. And people are constantly claiming, if you read British history at almost all periods, they're constantly making claims about the significance of Magna Carta. I mean, the best example of that was a British female suffrage activist I found in the early 20th century who told a cheering audience that women's rights had been provided for in the Magna Carta. And everyone says, "Hooray!" So it becomes, like the American Constitution is in some ways, an imaginary artifact of great potency. But the Bill of Rights is important, not least, of course, it's important on the other side of the Atlantic, where the Americans do pick up on some of its provisions, as, for example, the right to arms, and run with it.
There's one here.
Yes, Chris Haley. I was just wondering, have you ever written your own constitution? As a side question, perhaps you can say whether what you think should be in a constitution, even if you haven't written your own.
No, I haven't written a constitution. Perhaps I should. That there are various British academics I know who, in government departments and law departments, who, as academic exercises or political exercises, make their students draft imaginary British constitutions, but I haven't done that. What do I think constitutions should say? Well, that depends on where they are, but what I do think is perhaps useful is that constitutions should be fairly short. I don't think it's any accident that, there's all sorts of reasons why the US Constitution has survived as long as it has. But I think one of the reasons is that it has been, it's only 4,400 words. It's like a short story. And there's a lot of things it doesn't talk about. And the less you say very often, the better, because more people can agree about it. Though that said, I don't think the federal constitution of 1787 would ever have worked as well as it did within the limits of itself had it not been supported by constitutions in all the American states. And I think people forget about that. They talk about the US Constitution. And this is particularly so in Britain, because Britons don't really understand federalism, as you know. And people forget that beneath the, you wouldn't forget, but beneath the US federal constitution, there are all these state constitutions. And we now know that for the first half of the 19th century, for many Americans, these state constitutions were much more important than the federal constitution. People would talk of themselves as coming from Georgia or being Virginians. They wouldn't talk about themselves very often as being Americans. And indeed, for a long time in the early 19th century, the original US Constitution was lost. Someone put it in a tin box, and it sort of was put in a cellar, and for a couple of decades, you know, people couldn't find it. It's only really since the Second World War that this cult of the US Constitution has acquired these mammoth proportions.
Yes.
Sorry, oh, you go ahead. No. I'm sorry, I don't know how to put this well. The nation, I think, has been defined as an imagined community, and you've emphasised the importance of imagined constitutions. Do you have any views about the best mechanisms for bringing imagined constitutions into line with the imagined community or the nation?
As I say, I think that, you know, I mean, one of the challenges is, you know, how do you get people to read these things? As I say, to read them without becoming overly obsessed by them. Ideally, constitution should be something that can come up as podcasts, as apps on one's computer. Why not? You know, if you want people to be involved, to have some kind of collective sense of democratic input, you have to think of new ways, I think, of making these devices work. And, you know, as I say, and this is just my personal opinion, I do think probably that Jefferson was right. I think, you know, regularly returning to these documents or these podcasts or whatever they are, and talking about these things and getting them revised to adjust to societal change, which is now so much more rapid than in the late 18th century, is very important. And one of the challenges, one of the great challenges, of course, is making time in political life for this kind of thing to be done. But it is deeply important.
Oh, wait, the hands are springing up here. There's one down the front.
Yeah.
Matthew Lesh. My question goes to the amending and changing of constitutions. Do you foresee problems if constitutions are too easy to change, if they're too amendable, and special reference to maybe the Californian Constitution and citizen-initiated referendum?
Well, you know, human political life is inherently problematical. You know, there's no ideal form, and you know that was really what I wanted to try and get over. I think that, you know, I wish my own country, Britain, had some kind of written constitution, but on the other hand, I don't believe in this kind of constitutional idolatry that the Tea Party would like to advance. So, yeah, I mean, it picks up really on the previous question, that you want limits on authority, but you've also got to provide, of course, for efficient and effective government in increasingly difficult times. And some critics have said, for example, that one of the problems of US government now, with all these constitutional restraints and limits that are embedded in 1787 and in subsequent amendments, it's very, very difficult. I mean, it's always difficult outside a dictatorship, and even often then, for a ruler to get what he or she wants. But it's very difficult to get movement in sections of the US political system, because not only have you got the federal constitution, you've got these state constitutions, and they're all there to limit and regulate power. But when you've got expanding problems like climate change, if you believe in climate change, it's very hard indeed, not just because of partisan pressures, but because of all these writings to get effective government action of the sort that you may need.
We've been working our lecturer hard, so I think we'll make the one there the last question.
Hi, Jenny Jefferson. My question is also on amendments, and I wanted to know if you felt that amendments to the Constitution were constitutional changes or separate. What does that mean for the identity of the nation? For instance, the First and Second Amendments in the American Constitution. And also, is the US unique in doing these kind of amendments?
I should say absolutely that I am not a constitutional lawyer, and you should probably have a constitutional lawyer to answer that particular query as it deserves. But what I think I would say is that, well, various things. One of the British arguments against a written constitution of the US type, particularly in the 19th century, was in a sense precisely because of this whole issue of amendments and the Supreme Court. And the British argument, which was obviously a self-interested one in part, was that if you weren't careful, this was very slow and very elitist, that you relied on unelected judges in the Supreme Court to make these changes. And it could be a slow and arbitrary process. I think what has become increasingly clear in recent decades is that, and again there's controversy about this, but many Americans who are constitutional lawyers make this argument, that the Supreme Court in the United States has acquired sometimes a degree of power that really was never originally intended. And because it's in such a partisan environment as this, you have the Supreme Court acting at times like a very small and very irresponsible patrician House of Lords, making these decisions which are sometimes strange. I mean, you know, as a result of a recent Supreme Court decision, you can now take a gun on a train. Well, you know, I don't think this is very sensible. But, you know, you're stuck until the right number of people die. You're stuck with a Supreme Court which has an inbuilt conservative majority. And it's this Supreme Court that is regulating so many of these amendments. there must be a better way.
Well, on that cautionary note, we'll finish. I should advise of you who are not aware that the next session, 3:30, a panel on Australian history and the Australian present, well chosen, but perhaps uneven in composition. But on your behalf, I'd like to thank Linda for such a stimulating lecture, and thank you very much.